Welcome to the Balance and Brilliance podcast, a space where different perspectives and ideas converge to create powerful change. I'm your host, Terrence Hanna, serial entrepreneur and performance coach, and I'm joined by host Zoe McMahon, Fortune 100 executive and lifelong change maker. In this show, we share our complementary experiences and perspectives on topics that both propel and limit us all. We hope that by tuning in, you're able to launch yourself further with balance and brilliance. Like and subscribe to support the channel, and be sure to drop a comment below to lend your balance and brilliance to the world. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, welcome to Balance and Brilliance. I'm your host, Terrence Hanna.
And I'm Zoe McMahon.
And today we have a really exciting topic for you. We're going to be talking about imposter syndrome, how it manifests, different things, are ways people perceive it, and how it affects us. This is a resource that we are putting out there because we're really passionate about making sure that anyone who's struggling with this can at least have some additional resources and some thoughts from two professionals who are wanting to put this out and help the world. So Zoe, I'm going to pass it over to you. And how is imposter syndrome defined? Let's start there.
Yeah, well, there's probably as many definitions out there as you can count, right? So, but one that I think is more emotional than practical. I'd be curious to see if you've got others, but one that I've seen is that imposter syndrome. Jay Shetty defines it as when you believe that you do not belong, or that you don't deserve to exist in the abundant way that you really do. And I think that's a very kind of uh, almost new age kind of definition of imposter syndrome around a sense of belonging, which is of course a sort of human need. So, um, what's your take on that?
So when I was sort of looking this up, because I obviously have, my own definition and my own struggles that I've gone through, I definitely think it's somewhat of a universal thing that many people deal with in one way, shape, or form. But while I was looking at that, I wanted to get some other people's takes, and something interesting that I found was everything was different. So
Mm.
I brought it back to the dictionary so that we could get a little bit of a baseline for this discussion. So the dictionary defines imposter syndrome as the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. And
Yeah, that's I've seen that kind of definition too, and it's kind of very skills based.
mhm,
Like there's a felt sense of either real or not real sense that your skills aren't up to the situation that you're in or about to go into. And I think there's this other flip side to it, which is more of the mindset aspect of it, which is maybe links to that perception of skills gap. That is it a confidence issue? Is it a self-doubt issue? So it's not really about the skills per se. So I think there's two sides to it. There's a kind of skill, a real side to it, and then a mental side to it. Does that make sense?
give me a little bit more on the real side of it. I think I understand the mental side of it quite well, but I'm curious on what you're referring to.
Well, I mean, perception is everything, right? So I perhaps it could be true that let's say somebody's going into a new role, and it is a fact that they don't have some of the knowledge that they might need to have to perform that role, but
Mhm.
nevertheless, they are, being given an opportunity based on some other factors to take on that role. That person might be feeling some sense of imposter syndrome because they do actually have a skills gap relative to the functioning of the role. Now, you
I
can
see.
easily overcome that, right, through training, learning, whatever. But there's a real gap in what's needed to perform the role that you're going into, as opposed to you feel that sense of sort of fraudulence that you're maybe entering into a new context, but you have everything you need to go into that context skills wise, but you maybe still have doubt around performing in that way. So That's the distinction I was trying to draw. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so regarding
So,
the real world skills deficit that you're talking about, I think that I don't know how I feel about defining that as a form of imposter syndrome, because I think that in the sense of it being real, that somewhat obliterates the imposter aspect of that. But where I do see there being a massive tie in whether it be the imposter syndrome or a physical skills deficit, um, the practice of getting over that hurdle, I think would have a lot of similarities regarding
mhm,
pushing through it. Something that I've talked about a lot with my clients before is the concept of faking it till you make it. And something that I actually think that's fantastic. I really really encourage people to do that within the bounds of obviously ethics, making sure everything you're not no one's in danger or anything like that, but pushing your limits and the faking it until you make it. Because at the end of the day, if you fake it and you make it, were you really faking it? The skills that you had at your disposal were what you needed to accomplish the job. There's nothing faking it about that, right? And in the event that you fail in that circumstance, then that's a little bit different. Now, where I think the imposter syndrome aspect of that comes back, and I'd love to get your take on this, is in having the skills that you need to pursue whatever it is that or face whatever challenge that you're coming up against. um the fear of utilizing those skills, or the fear of taking the steps towards success because of any type of either physical or mental impedance that's in front of you, I think is that's the imposter syndrome aspect of that. But I'd love
mhm.
to get your take.
Yeah, you said something in there that reminded me of the notion of being outside your comfort zone. And to me, there's something related about these concepts, in career progression and development and even personal growth. There's often talk about needing to be uncomfortable, to get yourself out of your comfort zone. And I think it is when you enter that area of growth or discomfort in a new circumstance, either intentionally or unintentionally, you can find yourselves in situations that are outside your comfort zone. And I think that's when you start maybe to feel that imposter syndrome. And so I started thinking a bit about, well, what is that comfort zone? What's that all about? And I think because I'm a big fan of sort of personality science, I tend to ground the idea of being outside your comfort zone as you're behaving in ways that are maybe a little uncomfortable for you because they're not where you typically gravitate or orient your personality traits. There's a sort of personality science has at the heart of it sort of five big personality traits. And one of them, say, is introversion and extroversion. And so let's say you're more on the introverted side. If you are suddenly put into a circumstance where you need to be more extroverted, you're gonna you'll be able to do it because we can all lean into these things, but it'll feel uncomfortable. And
Hmm.
that's, I think, the feeling of being in your outside your comfort zone. It's something to do with your personality and how you perceive things. So I think taking it back to the imposter syndrome, yeah, I see that if you're kind of doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is pushing into that comfort zone area of yourself in order to grow, you're just going to feel imposter syndrome. Like, I think it's so completely normal. You started out this session by saying you'd certainly felt that. I definitely have. I've been a executive now, but at every point of my progression in HP and where I work right now, it's always been there. And
Hmm.
in fact, I think um, Rich Litvin, another famous sort of performance coach, he talks about imposter syndrome as not being something that you just need to recognize it. You're not trying to fight it. It's just there. And what you need to do is to just get good at it. Right. So what is getting good at? navigating that space and time when you're in a new role or coming up on a new role and you're outside your comfort zone for whatever reason. Yeah, what is that getting good at that? What does it look like?
Mhm. The something that you said there that I think is really interesting is who suffers, or you touched on, is who suffers from imposter syndrome. And something that I think is really interesting about the inherent nature of imposter syndrome is you're worried that other people would discover you for being the fraud that you think you are in that situation. And the reality is most people, if not everyone in those situations, is feeling the same thing in one way, shape, or form, or at least has felt that same thing before. And something that I've found is that the imposter syndrome will typically amplify at higher levels of performance. And that I know that seems like somewhat of a basic statement because obviously the more pressure and the more um, force that's on that individual, the more that could potentially apply. But something that I think is somewhat paradoxical about that is when we as individuals look up to people, we typically think that they've got it all together. They're the person who's not dealing with that thing. And I think something that holds a lot of us back from a performance basis or like getting out there and pursuing these goals is that feeling of, oh, I can't do what Elon Musk does because, I have all of these limiting factors and XYZ, or insert your famous uh, person there. But the reality is that it's not that they don't deal with it, they just have better mechanisms for overcoming it. And I think that that's
Mm.
something that is really, really valuable for anybody. It certainly was for me to look into. So
I agree that it's universal. I've definitely seen a lot of coverage that experience women executives experience imposter syndrome at quite high proportions. And I've often heard that that happens more often. I'm not sure I buy it. I think it's just a human thing to be when we don't like uncertainty. We don't like, not knowing how to do things. We're all a little bit neurotic and perfectionist, and I think it's normal. I think it's very, very normal. But yeah, I think even the most senior executives in our company, I'm pretty sure, at some point have the same. And if they didn't, they wouldn't be honoring their own growth. You know what I mean? They'd be kind of plateauing or getting stuck. And if you're not sort of dreaming big enough, you're not gonna experience that. But if you are pushing yourself, if you are trying to continue to grow, I think everybody's gonna experience it.
well, you just
Like I
said
said, I know it's
something.
not.
There's a lot there to unpack, but something that you just said that I loved was the pushing yourself aspect. And something that I certainly work with myself on whenever I experience something like this is that is the opportunity that you've been waiting for to push to the next level. So while it's not an enjoyable feeling to feel, the feeling of that imposter syndrome is the moment to rise to the occasion, in
Hmm.
my opinion. And regarding the women
I,
executives, oh
well,
sorry,
I'd love to
no,
think of no,
yeah,
no, no, it's
please.
fine. I, I I think this is interesting about sort of pushing and intentionality. Like I changed jobs about 12, 14 months ago, and I was deliberate. I said, I want to get out of my comfort zone. I've been doing this last role now for 8 years, even though it is immensely challenging and really rich I loved it. But I could tell that I could do it for another 2 years and I wouldn't get anything new experience wise out of it. And so I intentionally said, all right, I'm going to do this. I think I'm still in that uncomfortable space 12 months later, just for anyone who's weren't wondering. So yeah, I think it's definitely interesting. But when I think back to earlier stages in my career, I part of me is wondering if the term has just become more out there, we didn't talk about imposter syndrome, I don't know, 20 years ago. At least I didn't. And I'm curious if the label of it is, it's almost an excuse or a dressing for something that was just normal anxiety, normal, concern, lack of confidence. Now it's got a name, right? And you can study
Insecurity.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I actually wholeheartedly agree with that. I was thinking about this before we got on here about actually, giving full credit to this sort of train of thought stemmed from Gary Vaynerchuk, who I really enjoy watching. But he was talking about the term imposter syndrome being somewhat of a dangerous notion, if you will, because it's sort of, a boutique term for normalizing insecurities. Now, insecurities are something that we all deal with and struggle with, and I am paraphrasing Gary here. Um, but fighting to overcome those insecurities is far more valuable uh, than normalizing them. And I personally agree with that wholeheartedly. If you have the courage and grit to face your insecurities and overcome those insecurities, that's just simple math. You're going to be farther ahead than if you just learn to live with those insecurities. I think that's something that we can all agree on. Now, I don't think that anyone's arguing that imposter syndrome isn't something to um, try and overcome, and it's just something that we all deal with. Um, I do, in a sense, I disagree with it in a sense, though, that I feel like putting a more approachable spin on it. I do find imposter syndrome to be more approachable in that type of a sense. I don't, you know, I don't know what you think about that, but
Mm. Yeah, it's got you know, the term insecurity is kind of negative. It has this sense of you're lacking something, you're lacking in confidence or self-security or something. Imposter syndrome is a rather more neutrally framed statement, right, of something that you're just experiencing. No judgment, right? It's not about you. It's simply I don't know, a neurological pattern of thoughts and emotions that are arising because you're in a certain circumstance. You're doing something different. You're learning, you're growing, you're outside of yourself, and it's going to feel like something. That doesn't mean you are weak or insecure or missing. So I think there's something about the term being more neutral that allows us to talk about it as a thing versus a flaw in our personalities.
yeah, I agree with that. And you know what? I think identifying the thing, right? The fact that it is a real thing, you know what it is, and that it is manageable. And over time, it actually is a signal for opportunity. I think is
Mm,
really, really important, sort of reframing that. But you had talked about how imposter syndrome can affect female executives in the workplace. And actually, something I thought was really interesting. It was a little clip I pulled up. I'd love to share with you. It is a very high level tech CEO out of Australia talking about a moment of massive imposter syndrome that he had to deal with. Now, admittedly, in the discussion previous in this recording, we had talked about the skills deficit aspect of that and how that can affect you, and that's certainly what this is. But I'm just going to play this clip here, and I'd love to get your take on it. This is Mike Cannon Brooks on a TED Talk, and I'll post the full TED Talk in the description.
People thinking I'm someone I'm not actually happens quite frequently. A great example from my more recent past, a few months ago, I was up late at night with one of my kids, and I saw something on Twitter about Tesla saying that they could solve South Australia's rolling series of power crises with one of their large industrial batteries. Now, without thinking, I fired off a bunch of tweets challenging them and saying, were they really serious about this? And in doing so, I managed to kick a very small rock off a very big hill that turned into an avalanche that I found myself tumbling in the middle of. Because you see, a few hours later, Elon tweeted me back and said that they were deadly serious. That within 100 days of contract signing, they could install a 100 megawatt hour facility, which is a giant battery on a world-class size, one of the biggest ever made in the planet. And that's when all hell really broke loose. Within 24 hours, I had every major media outlet texting and emailing and trying to get in contact with me to get opinion as some sort of expert in energy. Now, at the time, I couldn't really have told you the difference between a 1.5 volt AA battery that goes in my kids' toys and a 100 megawatt hour industrial scale battery facility that goes in South Australia that could potentially solve their power crisis. So I was now feeling a chronic case of imposter syndrome, and it got truly bizarre. And I remember thinking to myself, shit, kind of started something here, and I can't really get out. If I abandon the situation, I'm going to sort of set back renewables in Australia and maybe just look like a complete idiot because of my idiocy on Twitter. So I thought the only thing I could do was to try not to freeze and to try to learn. So I spent a week trying to learn everything I could about industrial scale batteries and the electricity grid and renewables and the economics of all this and whether this was even a feasible proposal. I talked to the chief scientist, I talked to the CSIRO, had multiple ministers and premiers trying to give me their side of the story from both sides of the aisle. Managed to exchange tweets with the Prime Minister, even managed to pull off a passing impression, let's say, of an energy expert on ABC Lateline. But as a result of all this, South Australia did put out a battery tender, and they had more than 90 applications for that battery tender. And
so I'll pause it there, but that's an absolutely fantastic story of being thrown into a situation and dealing with that type of imposter syndrome and combination of skills deficit, because this gentleman is a very knowledgeable and he's a very appointed CEO. So he certainly has grounds to speak on it. But what's your take on that? What do you think about that?
What I liked about it was that there's this kind of not afraid to fail attitude, because, and I think it's present in that moment because it was a very intense, kind of concentrated experience, unlike a sort of normal work promotion or something where the events are happening like slower than that. That was a very rapid situation where I think I had to kind of just cut speed really pretty fast, high stakes, high exposure situation. So, but I think you can draw lessons from that into a more, slow burn kind of real world example of like, okay, that guy got thrown into the den. But sometimes, like me, somebody might intentionally jump onto a new role or get new responsibilities where they're suddenly feeling like that same sense of exposure that he was describing, like, whoa, okay, all of a sudden I'm expected to do things and I've not done this before, or I don't know what I'm doing. But it happens much slower than that guy. But I think there are lessons, and I think his approach, which is like, okay, well, I'm here now, so let's do this, and not overthink it, not like try to get sort of locked up in, perfection. I think there's a tie here with what I was saying about not being afraid to fail, and this idea of not needing to be perfect. Because if you focus too much on perfectionism, that's when you get locked up in paralysis. If you're in that sort of imposter syndrome zone, that's one of the things that you could be feeling, right? Is like, or one of the reasons behind it is your sense of perfectionism. And this guy clearly was like, I'm just gonna have to let that go because this is like moving super fast and just move.
Well, I think that I love what you said there about fear of failure. So for me personally, and again, when you're looking at something, I mean, granted, there is the standardized definition of imposter syndrome you can find in the dictionary, but it manifests itself differently in different individuals and people experience it differently. So the solutions are going to be different for everybody. But I do think that there's common themes that we can draw from and work for. So regarding that, for me personally, overcoming a fear of failure, which I've spent a tremendous amount of time working on, and I'm very thankful that, you know, just absolutely miles ahead of where I used to be in my younger years, um, is the biggest thing for overcoming imposter syndrome. The fear of what comes up within moments of imposter syndrome, I think is really driven for a lot of people by a fear of failing or a fear of, the being exposed aspect. And I mean, however that's going to manifest. But being comfortable with that feeling, I think is a far more productive way of getting through it than trying
Mm.
to eliminate the feeling altogether.
Yeah, and fear of failing. So I think this is super interesting because I think I do it a little differently in these circumstances. I don't know if I'm like one step back even than fear of failing. I'm like, I'm not even gonna put that. It's like fear of failing, right? So I'm not even gonna put myself in that situation because if I was in that situation, I might have that fear of failure. It's even one layer back from that. So I think people hold themselves back for all kinds of reasons. But you said something that I thought was interesting, uh being like exposed. We were talking a bit about that a minute ago, and I was reminded of that, the definition that I brought at the beginning, which is around when you think you don't belong. So that there's that sense of exposure. Suddenly you're the one that isn't like everybody else because you're showing up as like an idiot or whatever. And it's that sense of, or assumption, that everyone else knows what they're doing and you're the one that doesn't know what they're doing. That is a false assumption, as you were saying earlier. So I think this human need to feel belonging, we want to kind of be like everybody else. We want to seem like everybody else so that we're in the club that we're in and it's working well. But as soon as you step into a different space and you're different and you're not sure yet if you belong in this club, I think that sense of belonging is also part of it, as well as the fear of failure, right? They're related. But I think if you're not, people talk about this, if you're not, um, if you're you said this to me, if you're comfortable with, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room, kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, if you're too comfortable, it's definitely a sign that you want to be upping your imposter syndrome for the week. You want to be jumping out there. Otherwise, you're not growing. So yeah, I do think fear of failure is part of it. But is that because we just want to be, you know, liked, accepted, respected, included in a conversation? And that the reality is we already are. We already are those things. It's just we think we're not, and whatever it takes to overcome that mindset or reframe it so that we get comfortable that, yeah, okay, maybe there's a skills gap, I can address that, but that's part of the game. But after that, I deserve to be here because of all of these things that I've brought to the table.
Well, that's
Um,
something you touched. That's something that's I find really, really interesting about the sort of internal psychology of all of this is if you have 20 people, or if a lot of people, and how it will manifest in many people is you can have everybody around you telling you that you're good at something and still feel that you're not, and feel that all of those people are being untruthful about the skills that you're portraying. And I find that to be quite interesting, because we're at that point, when you're that far into your head on that, that becomes a really big challenge. And it comes down to you digging down into your strengths and real life examples that you've gone through and shown that you have inalienable proof that you can prove yourself wrong, and that you can believe those people that are around you. And
yes, yeah, I think something I was thinking about on this, which is a common thread for me in most sort of professional challenge situations, is this idea of zooming out. And what I mean by that in this context is, if you're focused on, can I do this thing that I'm feeling uncomfortable about, you're not seeing, unless you kind of sit back, zoom out, you're not seeing what you just said, which is everything that came before. All the reasons you got to this moment have kind of been put in the rear window, right? And if you're not looking at that wide view, if you're just focused on this current circumstance and why it's making you uncomfortable, I think you're missing bringing either your perspective of, as you said, the strengths you bring to the table up to that moment, but also the fact that if you fast forward and if you zoom out and look at yourself 6 months from now and say, am I going to be feeling like this 6 months from now? The answer is probably no, because you've had the time to get comfortable, to work through it. And so it's a very momentary thing to feel that. And it's a consequence of not, if you can sort of step back and say, well, okay, I know I can bring these things to the table, and I know that in 6 months I won't be feeling like this.
Mm-hmm.
I think it helps. Just knowing that there's that bigger view, I think helps or can help people to overcome this feeling, to know that it's temporary, right?
Yeah, I agree. I've been so we're getting close to the end here, and you have an absolute wealth of experience, both as an executive, as a coach, building a business. You've got a lot and many more things. You've got a lot that you can share with people here. So for anybody who's watching right now, who may be feeling like they're struggling with some imposter syndrome or wanting to pursue something, granted, there's a lot of nuanced techniques for different individuals, but what are a couple of just basic tips that you think that you could advise to somebody struggling with this to just get the ball rolling on overcoming their imposter syndrome?
Well, I think acknowledging first awareness, right? Acknowledging that's what I'm experiencing and that it's completely normal.
Yeah.
That might help overcome half of it, right? Just acknowledging that that's what it is.
Just a wee
It's
slice
not a
of
big
half
deal. It's totally
right there.
normal. Yeah, exactly. It's just a passing moment, and just being aware is number one. Um, and then I think taking that wide view of like, okay, well, this is a passing moment. What could I actually do in this moment to help myself feel differently? Is this a real skills gap? Is this a mindset issue? Is there something about this that is, a confidence problem for me? Maybe go seek out mentorship or coaching to challenge some of those things in yourself. So I think that's the second part, is looking at what's the root cause of the feeling that I'm having, because it could be a number of different reasons in different situations. Imposter syndrome is consistently going to show up in your life, but it might show up in different ways at different times based on the circumstances, right? So that's the second part. And then my third part, I think, is just um, to have fun, right? Just to kind of play with it, look at it a little bit like a game. It's like, oh, okay,
Yes.
I see you. I see you, imposter syndrome. Let's do this. Let's rise to that opportunity. But I would say as well, like I've been so guilty of not even letting myself get to the table. My husband often jokes with me that every time I'm going for a job that's of a higher level, I tell him I'm not ready yet. And he says, "So you said that the last 5 times, and you were just fine." Um, and so I think sometimes we hold ourselves back from even experiencing the discomfort because we're so afraid of it. So I would say, go for it, expect it, be aware that that's what you're feeling, and zoom out, tackle whatever issue it is, face it, right, and have fun with it.
I think that's fantastic advice. And if I was going to say anything on that, bringing my experience to bear on that point, identifying it, the first point that you brought up is massive, absolutely massive. Because what does that do? That shifts the fear to knowledge, right? Okay, now I know that this is what it is, and not just I'm afraid of doing that. And to be honest, you said, I think that takes care of half of it right there. Um, I would argue that number is conservative. I would bet that identifying what you're going through is I'm not going to put a number on it, but having that identifier, having the face on what you're fighting in that circumstance, I think is absolutely massive. Um, Two for me is starting. So the fear of failure that we talked about, a technique that I used, which has been massively successful for me, is turning my fear of failure from a non-starter to the reason that drives me forward. And the difference in that is starting. So if I start something, that fear of failure that I have turns into a drive and a passion in making sure that what I'm doing is not going to fail. And granted, you need to be comfortable with the fact that it might, but it's, for me at least, it's utilizing that fear, because that fear is always going to be there. It's just using it as a tool, in my opinion. I mean, that's just how
Mhm.
I perceive that, anyways. And another thing
Well,
is,
well, and I think we have to fail more, right? We have to fail more. I haven't done a very good job of this in my life, because of a fear of failure. I try and avoid it like anything, right? But all the literature points to you got to fail more than you succeed. You've got to, if you're not failing, 9 times out of 10, you're not trying, you're not going to grow. And I think there's a lot of reasons why people are afraid of failure. The most successful people fail a ton.
yeah,
And, they use those opportunities not just um, of when they fail. Yes, you can use the opportunity to try not to fail, like you just described, but when you fail, because you will, when you fail, then using that learning moment to kind of snowball into the next iteration, um, I think is really key. And I would say in the last 12 months, even for me, and I'm still, fairly advanced in my professional career, only in the last 12 months or so, I would say, have I really embraced this idea of kind of performance agility, I would call it, where you're just going fast, learning quick learning cycles, right? Because if you can do that, you can get much further and faster than kind of spending a lot of time planning and thinking about it, and just waiting too long to get the feedback on the direction that you need. So yeah, I say get out of your comfort zone, but be willing to fail and willing to learn fast,
yeah,
right? I think
absolutely.
that,
And the third point that I was going to bring up, you actually just hit on right there, and that's feedback. So
yep,
if you have a network of people around you, I'm assuming if you're looking at pursuing something that you're feeling imposter syndrome over, you have a network of people around you, and take that feedback, both the positive and the negative, use or I should say constructive, right? Because if somebody's telling you that they think that you're going to be good at something, and you have multiple people telling you that you're going to be good at something, and you want to pursue that, but what's holding you back is your fear of being good at said thing, you need to understand and acknowledge that that's an internal fear and not an external reality. And
yeah,
what do you do at that point? You need to look at the external reality. And in that moment, you have people around you who are wanting to support you. And
yeah.
speaking of people wanting to support you, that is us. I think that's all the time we have for today. I want to pass it over to you before just sort of get into anything else. So do you have any final thoughts on imposter syndrome that could help anybody listening today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe one last lesson, is not mine, but I heard an excellent speaker yesterday at a conference talk about authority, how you develop authority, and I think if you can develop that sense of authority, maybe that's another way to overcome that imposter syndrome. And these four aspects of how to feel like you have authority. Number one is always confidence, and there's a ton of stuff around how you develop confidence. The second is something that you mentioned early on, which is to know your impact. And I think what I mean by that is all of the strengths and skills that have come before, and that they have been working, and not to leave them in the rearview mirror, as I mentioned earlier, to really bring them to the table and know your impact, that you can articulate that, know that you have an impact, right? The third is presence, having a strong visual presence, having a strong sense of yourself and your authenticity, and then strong communication skills. If you're able to communicate strongly with presence about your impact with confidence, you have that authority and you can lean on that and hopefully overcome the sense of imposter syndrome that is inevitable in wherever you're going right next. And so, yeah, I think that's some more tips perhaps for the folks listening to take home and apply and in this very, very normal problem that we all share.
If you like what you heard today, I know I did, go down below, give us a like and subscribe, and also let us know how you deal with imposter syndrome. Is this something that you've faced? How have you overcome it? Everybody experiences this differently. So if you have an experience and you are willing to share it down below, you could help somebody else overcome something that they're dealing with. And let's all grow and push forward together as a community. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in to Balance and Brilliance with Zoe McMahon and Terrence Hanna, and we will catch you on the next episode. Have a fantastic day.
Looking forward to it. In this episode of the Balance and Brilliance podcast, Terry and I talk about our different perspectives and experiences of imposter syndrome. Pretty popular topic in professional development and personal growth circles. We started looking at some definitions, recognizing that there are many out there, each with their own spin. We explored that a skills deficit can contribute to a feeling of imposter syndrome, but also that there are other self-confidence or mindset-related aspects to it. The outcome, whatever the gap at hand, seems to be a feeling of not belonging. Like the term says, you feel like an imposter in a new environment, and that's just uncomfortable for us as social beings. This took us into a discussion about comfort zones. It is widely recommended that we get out of our comfort zone as a strategy for growth. It is precisely when we do this, though, that we can feel that imposter syndrome, leading us to the point that comes up several times in this episode, that imposter syndrome is normal and universal. Terry, the perpetual optimist, actually sees the opportunity in those moments of discomfort as a signal of when to get going. This is a typical Zoe and Terry thought process difference. I liken this to when traffic lights go from green to amber to red. Terry is seeing the amber light as a sign to go faster, not to be held back. I see the warning light as an external sign that conditions are changing. It's not a reflection on my abilities, but I am entering a junction. The clip that Terry shared from Mike Cannon-Brookes highlights how sometimes we can be thrown into circumstances where we might feel imposter syndrome more intently. He really used the opportunity to get knowledgeable quickly and seemed pretty fearless in his response in that high-stakes situation. This brought up the notion of fear of failure, and we discussed how overcoming a fear of failure is one of the keys to overcoming imposter syndrome. Other tips that I had for overcoming imposter syndrome were first to recognize it for what it is, and to maintain a wide view that it is a temporary feeling. I also shared that we need to address the gap to understand what is behind the feeling and go after it, whether it be a skills gap or a mindset shift. And finally, to have fun with it, look at it like a game, and to use it to find the opportunities to grow. Terry built on these further, concurring with me that awareness is essential as it puts a face on the problem. He also mentioned just starting. I absolutely loved his comment that he has often turned his fear of failure from a non-starter to the reason that drives him forward. Finally, we both reflected on the importance of rapid learning cycles and getting feedback from others to help us manage the reality of a situation and not just our own perception. You know, we love talking through this kind of thing. I hope that you will grab the bull by the horns next time you feel that imposter syndrome creeping up on you, and trust yourself that if you are in the room, you absolutely belong there. Don't forget, tune in next time for more balance and brilliance reflections on thriving at work and in life.